There's a version of diplomacy that isn't actually trying to reach an agreement at all. It's trying to survive long enough that the agreement stops mattering. And according to a growing body of analysis from people who've spent decades studying Iran, that's exactly the game Tehran has been playing with Washington for months. Not because its negotiators are incompetent, but because dragging this out, deliberately, patiently, might be the single smartest move available to a country that just got battered by war and knows it can't win a rematch right now. Let's start with the blunt assessment from analysts tracking these talks closely, because the framing here matters enormously. According to reporting from the Times of Israel, for Iran, still recovering from a brutal 6-week U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign that degraded its military capabilities, and still facing the constant threat of renewed attack, there is a genuine, calculated benefit to simply using negotiations to buy time, regardless of whether the actual gaps between Washington and Tehran's positions are ever resolved. One regional analyst, Sabti, described the current dynamic in stark terms. Iran, in his words, wants to earn some time, characterizing the entire situation as a tactical pause rather than a genuine diplomatic opening. And what is Iran reportedly doing with that time? According to this same analysis, Tehran is using the cover of ongoing diplomacy to quietly rebuild what the bombing campaign degraded, specifically its ballistic missile program and its network of regional proxy militias, the very capabilities that gave it leverage across the region before this war started. That's the uncomfortable core insight underneath this entire story. Talks that never quite conclude aren't necessarily a diplomatic failure from Iran's perspective. They can function as cover. A period where the guns stay mostly quiet, sanctions pressure, sometimes eases at the margins, and Tehran gets exactly the breathing room it needs to reconstitute the tools that make it dangerous again, all while appearing, publicly, to be a good faith participant in a peace process. There's a specific structural detail in how Iran has approached these negotiations that reveals this strategy in granular detail. According to reports cited by the Times of Israel, Iran has proposed a very particular sequencing for these talks, addressing the Strait of Hormuz and other more immediate transactional issues first, while deliberately saving the far more consequential nuclear question for last. On the surface, that might look like simple prioritization, tackling the easier wins before the hardest problem. But analysts reading between the lines see something more calculated, a strategy that could let Iran avoid renewed war and resume normal economic trade through the Strait, all without ever having to give up its single most valuable piece of leverage, its nuclear program, the one bargaining chip Tehran has consistently signaled it has no intention of surrendering easily. Not every analyst agrees on how deliberately hostile this sequencing actually is. Dennis Ross, one of the more prominent voices quoted in coverage of these talks, has argued that President Trump is unlikely to lift the naval blockade currently squeezing Iranian ports without real concessions on the nuclear front specifically, suggesting Washington isn't simply going to let Iran cash in the easier wins while indefinitely stalling the harder question. Another analyst, Vakil, offered a slightly more generous read of Iran's approach, suggesting that delaying the nuclear conversation could simply be Tehran's way of getting negotiations moving at all, breaking an initial diplomatic logjam by starting with lower stakes issues both sides can more easily agree on. But even Vakil's more charitable interpretation comes with a serious caveat attached. Leaving the actual core problem, the nuclear issue, unaddressed for too long is, in her own words, dangerous. A ticking structural risk sitting underneath whatever short-term progress gets made on shipping and sanctions relief. This isn't a new pattern specific to this particular round of negotiations either, and that's precisely the argument at the center of a sharply written opinion piece published in the Washington Post back in April. The author, who left Iran in 1976, has spent nearly 5 decades watching American administrations of every ideological stripe cycle through essentially every conceivable strategy toward the Islamic Republic: containment, engagement, sanctions, covert operations, and now open war. And in the author's own telling, each of those approaches has arrived, eventually, at the exact same destination: a regime that ends up more consolidated than before it started, and a population left more abandoned by the outside world than when the policy began. The piece describes the most recent round of Islamabad-mediated talks not as some genuinely new chapter in this relationship, but as the latest performance of a play Washington keeps staging, over and over, expecting a different ending each time. That's a genuinely damning historical argument if you accept its premise, that the pattern of failed, drawn-out negotiations with Iran isn't a series of isolated diplomatic misfires, but a repeating structural feature of how this relationship has always worked, one that consistently benefits whichever government in Tehran manages to outlast the current American administration's attention span and political patience. And there's a deeper strategic logic underneath all of this that Fox News' own reporting captured well, drawing on analysis from defense policy experts, examining exactly why Iran keeps betting on this drawn-out approach, rather than simply capitulating outright to overwhelming American military superiority. Rosemary Kalanick, an analyst at Defense Priorities, laid out the asymmetric logic in especially clear terms. One country, she noted, is dramatically stronger militarily, but the weaker country, in this case Iran, simply cares more about the outcome, and historically, the side that cares more tends to win by outlasting the stronger one, not by ever matching it force for force. Kalanick went further, arguing that Iran is signaling as much resolve as it possibly can, precisely because it likely doubts Washington's own resolve. From Tehran's perspective, she explained, the stakes of this conflict are genuinely existential for Iran's government, while for the United States, however costly and frustrating this war has become, the stakes simply aren't existential in the same way. That asymmetry in what each side actually stands to lose is, according to Kalanick, the entire foundation of Iran's negotiating strategy. A separate analyst, Behnam Taleblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, offered a complimentary read on where Iran's real leverage actually comes from in these talks. It isn't Iran's ability to win a prolonged, direct military conflict with the United States, a fight Tehran knows it would eventually lose in purely conventional terms. It's Iran's demonstrated ability to threaten wider regional instability, disrupting shipping, striking American allies, destabilizing Gulf economies, even if it can't ultimately win the underlying war those threats are meant to prevent. That's precisely the kind of leverage that gets stronger, not weaker, the longer negotiations drag on without resolution. Because every additional week of uncertainty is another week Iran can use to remind the region and Washington of exactly how much damage it's still capable of inflicting. None of this exists in a vacuum either. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been remarkably direct about at least one of Tehran's genuine red lines throughout this entire process, stating flatly in an interview with Al Jazeera that Iran's ballistic missile program is simply never negotiable, and warning explicitly that Iran would target American bases across the Middle East if provoked. That's not the language of a government quietly stalling while it privately plans to eventually fold on every major demand. It's a government drawing a hard public line specifically around one of the capabilities analysts say it's actively trying to rebuild during this exact negotiating window, which raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. If the missile program is explicitly off the table, and the nuclear question keeps getting pushed to the end of the agenda, what exactly is left for these talks to actually resolve? Beyond the narrower, more transactional issues like reopening the Strait of Hormuz, it's also worth remembering that this dynamic, Iran denying or downplaying the significance of talks, even while engaging in them through intermediaries, isn't unique to this particular round either. Iranian officials have, at various points throughout this broader diplomatic saga, denied making outreach to Washington at all, even while separate reporting confirmed messages were actively being passed through mediators like Oman. One Middle East analyst, examining that exact pattern of public denial paired with quiet, continued engagement, argued that such denials are rarely accidental in high-stakes diplomacy. They serve multiple purposes simultaneously, reinforcing Iran's domestic narrative of resisting American pressure, managing expectations ahead of Iran's own internal political calendar, and testing the international community's resolve, all while potentially resetting the perceived balance of bargaining power before any real, substantive negotiation actually has to happen. That's a strategy of controlling the frame and the timing of engagement, rather than genuinely refusing to engage at all, and it maps almost perfectly onto the broader pattern analysts describe when they say Iran benefits from talks that never quite conclude. So what does all of this actually add up to, practically, for anyone trying to figure out whether these negotiations are heading somewhere real? The honest answer, according to the range of analysts cited across this reporting, is that Iran's incentives and America's incentives are simply not symmetrical, and pretending otherwise is exactly the mistake that's defined so many previous rounds of failed diplomacy with Tehran. Washington, and specifically the Trump administration, is operating on a political clock, eager for a resolution it can point to as a clear, decisive win, particularly with domestic political considerations like the midterm elections looming over the calendar. Iran, by contrast, is operating on what amounts to a survival clock, one where every additional month of unresolved talks is another month to rebuild missile stockpiles, another month to reconnect with regional proxy networks, another month for global attention and American political patience to drift toward whatever crisis comes next. That doesn't necessarily mean these talks are entirely hollow or that no genuine progress is possible. The Times of Israel's own reporting notes real, tangible movement on narrower issues, particularly around reopening the Strait of Hormuz, precisely the kind of transactional lower-stakes agreement that benefits both sides in the short term without requiring either government to compromise on its core, non-negotiable red lines. But the deeper, more consequential question, the actual nuclear issue that started so much of this conflict in the first place, remains, in the words of reporting on these talks, largely intractable, parked deliberately at the end of the agenda. exactly where analysts say Iran wants it to stay for as long as it possibly can. If the historical pattern the Washington Post's opinion piece describes holds true one more time, if this really is just the latest performance of a play Washington has staged with Iran for nearly 5 decades now, then the actual test of these negotiations was never going to be whether talks continue. Talks, by nearly every account, are exactly what Iran wants right now, drawn out, ongoing, never quite reaching a breaking point in either direction. The real test is whether Washington can find a way to change the fundamental incentive structure underneath these negotiations, whether through sustained pressure, meaningful economic leverage, or some combination neither side has managed to land on yet, before Iran finishes doing exactly what analysts across multiple outlets now believe it's already doing quietly in the background, rebuilding, patiently, everything this war was supposed to take away.